As a planner, you know how important it is to build community and keep your skills sharp. Pick up a fresh idea from a colleague, find your next employer, get inspired by your pick of over 200 education sessions. Experience all this and more at APA's 2026 National Planning Conference. This April, come gather with the heart of the planning profession in Detroit, a city that knows what it means to innovate. Register today at planning.org/conference. You never know who you'll meet. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome back, bookworms. I'm Stephanie Rouse.
I'm Jennifer Hiatt.
And we're the hosts of the Booked on Planning podcast. In today's episode, we talked with author Jamie Madden on his book, Bittersweet Lane, Creating Homes in the American Affordable Housing Crisis. This was a book sent to us, and I'm so glad it was because I found it to be a really incredibly interesting read. I always love to expand my knowledge in the world of affordable housing since that's what I do day to day. But this one I thought was super interesting because it wasn't just a fact-based book about affordable housing, but it was a memoir kind of combined with affordable housing coming from Jamie's experience growing up in an affordable housing project.
Yeah, and listeners, if you're like me and the first time you had to review a capital stack or anything like that was a few years into your career, this is also an excellent book as Jamie really does explain the ins and outs of, yes, development of affordable housing, but also the principles that he utilizes really just expand on development in general. So if you're wanting to learn about the development process, it's an equally good read.
Yeah, and he's got a whole appendix of additional resources and more targeted information that is helpful to that point.
My favorite thing from his appendix is his poem on how to create a pro forma. So when you pick up the book, you should definitely check that out.
Yeah, and he's got fun little acronyms for different aspects of the development process. One is a puppy, and I'm blanking on exactly what that stands for, but...
So pick up the book and find out, readers.
Yeah.
Well, it was a wonderful conversation, so let's get into it with our author, Jamie Madden, on his book, Bittersweet Lane, Creating Homes in the American Affordable Housing Crisis.
Jamie, thank you for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, Bittersweet Lane, Creating Homes in the American Affordable Housing Crisis. I really enjoyed your book as it was kind of part memoir, part education on affordable housing developments. My whole world now is affordable housing here at the City of Lincoln. So it was a really interesting read. And you have such a unique perspective having grown up in an affordable housing project and now you're a developer working on getting them built. How has your background really helped shape the projects that you work on?
Probably in every way, like all of us, but let me start with, it's such a pleasure to be here. I've been wicked excited for the conversation. It's been a little bit of time in coming, and many of the books that I cite and enjoy are past episodes of yours, so I hope any listeners will go back to some of those. How does my perspective shape me? I think it's the multiple perspectives more than anything, that when I'm doing my work, it's somewhat natural for me to think about it from a resident perspective, as well as from a developer perspective or public policy and planning perspective. And I've got a good few friends in the building trades who will give me shit to make sure their perspectives are heard as well. And that multiple perspectives, I think, gives me a good understanding of the chain of consequences that little decisions in design or the development program or policies have on the residents' lives, but also the work of the people actually building it, the people actually managing and maintaining the building. Small details like laundry and garbage disposal, ephemeral but life-changing things like certification and application processes. Housing is incredibly impactful, and those multiple perspectives, I think, give us the best possible way to help folks when we can get all of it in there.
Jamie, first of all, I want to apologize. I've been down with some awful virus, so my voice is terrible. But you, like Stephanie and I, have a master's in planning. Your master's is from MIT. And one of your professors taught you that planning is not the driving force, it is the resulting one. And I thought that was such an interesting perspective to think about planning. So can you talk about what your professor meant there and what, in your experience, you think of as city planning?
Yeah. So that comes from the late great Professor Tunny Lee, who was a really impactful mentor of mine, and we lost during the COVID pandemic in 2021. When I was in grad school, I helped him on research and teaching a seminar and later trying to build a website on this way of understanding cities that he called people, place, and planning. And being at MIT and both of us being from Boston and Boston being generally a good case study for this sort of thing, the class was immigration in Boston's ethnic neighborhoods. And what he means by planning is not the driving force, it's the reactionary one, is that as much as when we're sitting down in front of a computer or a community with a big piece of butcher paper or something, we think it's blank, that's a fiction, right? We're always dealing in real places in a longer flow and chain of history. And so Tani would try to make sure that we understood when we're working in a place that it's important to think about who lives there and why. Why did they leave where they were before? What is it about the place they're in now that brought them there? Who lived there before them? Why did they leave or what happened? And understanding those flows of people and the why then birth the interventions that we see in housing or transportation or parks. I think there's a lot of professional self-respect in trying to view these things as neutral actors and trying to speak as if we're neutral. But I think the honesty of history is that usually planning interventions are done in reaction to some change and are about whoever has the power to make those interventions their reaction to the change. And that might include their prejudices about whoever those people are.
So, another quote from the book from you that I thought was really interesting is that you said, "We can't agree on who, what, or where because we can't agree on why," in reference to building affordable housing. What is the why that we need to convince everyone of?
Yeah, it's one of these things that feels very obvious to me. Everyone sleeps somewhere. Everyone should have a home. Turns out we've been studying this question over and over for 400 years in different versions. And when I discuss that in the book, I'm reacting in part to MIT professor Larry Vail's work on public housing, which for anyone interested in the history and the full sweep of public housing in America, his series is indispensable. And in Puritans to the Projects, which is kind of about the early history of public housing, he discusses how ideologically public housing and affordable housing falls in between two different things that the US knows how to do. We know how to do things to punish people: prisons, poorhouses, slave quarters, tenements. We know how to do things to reward people: tax credits, parks, nice schools, etc. And from very, very early days when Congress would never have even passed the initial public housing bills during Roosevelt, were it not paired with slum clearance to tear people's neighborhoods down. From those very beginnings, we've never been clear on, is this a punitive institution or is this an institution that is infrastructure or meant for helping people? And I feel like that mentality has never fallen away from it. You can see the thinking pervade not just the public, but in our profession, our very large and expensive focus on compliance and eligibility, endless public discussions about punitive approaches to homelessness, despite all reason and data. I'm hoping my book can help people think more deeply about these whys and why we should do it, but it really shouldn't take the 120,000 words. It really should be as simple as everyone should have a place to live.
Yeah, but it seems like the most simple observations are the hardest ones to solve in planning. Everyone should have a place to sleep. Everyone should have clean water and clean air and access to food. But those are like our four biggest questions that we fight in this profession.
Yeah. And I think those are apt analogies, particularly water and food, because these are human necessities. I think most of the conversations we end up having about housing are more about investment value or larger management of population flows or neighborhoods or something. But at core, housing is a human necessity, and I believe we should be treating it as such.
And even though we do know how to provide homes, and in the past, our government has done just that as a potential infrastructure project, turns out we're actually really shitty landlords, in your words. So, have we always been shitty landlords? And how did we let it get to the point where we are letting some of our housing stock that we've built to try and solve this problem molder into dust?
Yeah. I think there was really only a short period in which the United States attempted to be a good landlord, starting with some of the earliest forays in public housing that were really about like shipyard workforces and military veterans in the 19 teens and 1920s with World War I, and then expanding into public housing in the 1930s with Roosevelt and the New Deal. We tried for a little while. By the 1960s, we had completely given up on that. So 30s through 50s, we actually build housing, we fund it, In the 1960s, we change eligibility and funding requirements such that we create structural deficits for public housing authorities all over the country. And in the 60 some years since, we have done nothing but cut and cut and cut and ask people to do more and more with less, which is not how a good landlord would approach managing their properties, I think.
Well, and what's interesting, and I can't remember the exact figure in the book, but you give a figure if we just put this amount of funding into building housing and rehabbing our housing stock, then we could fix this solution. And the number is less than several federal agency budgets. Like it's a solvable solution. We just aren't putting the priority there.
That's exactly right. The numbers are not huge. In the book, the way I estimated it was I took the total number of people who are extremely cost burdened or currently experiencing homelessness to cast a wide net. And then I assumed a pretty conservative, I want to say maybe $400,000 per home in construction costs. In reality, we could do better. And came out with, I think it was like $240 billion in capital to catch up, and then about $250 billion annually in rental and mortgage assistance to solve this problem forever. To put that in context, that is one Jeff Bezos per year. We have a lot of those guys. This is only one of them per year that we'd really need. The ICE budget is $30 billion a year. That much alone could end child homelessness if we wanted to, say, prioritize children. And this is all fantasy while talking about the United States federal government in 2026. But I've been surprised even thinking about it at different levels. And so, for instance, in Seattle, we spend $30 million a year on homelessness sweeps. The cost of actually housing are, I believe it's 17,000 off the top of my head, people currently experiencing homelessness, comes out to about 20-25% of our police budget. These are priorities and these are choices. And even at the least logical, most risky level of government to try to do, say, a universal basic income or voucher program, turns out our city could afford it compared to what it's spending on other priorities.
Yeah, we're trying to make the case here that our justice system is spending significant amounts of money because we're criminalizing homelessness. And if we were to kind of reallocate some of our funding and put it more into building permanent supportive housing or a low barrier shelter, just places for people to actually receive housing services to help them build to a more stable situation, is worth reconsidering our budget priorities.
Absolutely. And I think if we're honest about housing for poor people in this country, we have to include the prison system as a part of that. We have more people that we are paying a tremendous amount of tax money on in prisons, in immigration detention, and other kind of carceral systems that we're paying for than we do in any single housing program. The federal prison system alone is bigger than Section 8. It's bigger than public housing. It's bigger than the tax credit program. So I don't talk in great detail about the prison system in my book. Go to Michelle Alexander and New Jim Crow for a primer if you haven't yet. But I think if I'm being honest about the system as a whole, I have to deal with the fact that prisons are a larger provider of housing than most of our other affordable housing programs.
Which is just insane. So physical construction of market rate projects is essentially the similar process for affordable housing projects, but the development side and how you have to finance it is very different. Can you describe what an affordable project has to deal with that a market rate project wouldn't, and how that impacts how these projects get built?
Sure, yeah. So any project, the three things we need to build are a place to build, permissions to build there, and the resources to direct labor and materials. The cost of doing all that we refer to as total development cost in housing and planning. In the private market, if that total development cost isn't exceeded by an acceptable amount above with the sales and rents that and revenue that it can justify, if you can't get a nice return on investment, you just don't do the project. That's where we start in affordable housing. We start from the this makes no economic sense, because the entire point, of course, is to keep sales or rents low enough that it's not going to pay for itself. So we have a huge deficit on the source side. On the use side, on the costs, we face all those same development costs, plus a lot of extra legal, accounting, and financial fees. We have a very, very complex financial system that has developed over the course of a century of really clever, well-meaning people trying to squeeze ever more pennies out of a really hostile system. And at this point, the way it works is you might have a mortgage loan as conventional real estate would. You will have an equity investor, but rather than benefiting from sales or cost flow. Our equity investors benefit from the low-income housing tax credit and other credit programs. And those two large capital sources together typically pay for about 60%, two-thirds of a development, with that last 40% or so coming from state, local, county, federal, occasionally private philanthropic funding sources. It's not unusual in affordable housing to have a dozen lawyers around the closing table because we've got 14 different financial participants, and you can imagine the exponential amount of time and complexity and expense as compared to development that doesn't need to think about those things. And that's just the financing side. On the design and construction side, we face a lot of additional requirements, many of them good, right? We want to pay labor better. We want to hold ourselves to a higher level of sustainability. Most of us intend to be developer, owner, managers, and we're going to house our residents for a long period of time. We're not going to sell the building, and that means we have to shell out for those really hardy, durable materials during construction that a condo developer from the private market might be aiming for something different in their design. And of course, the entitlement process as well. Getting those permissions can be much more controversial, much more difficult when you're trying to build homes for poor people. Although I'd say in some jurisdictions that is changing in some good ways. So it's a really complex, difficult way of doing things, and we manage to do it sometimes.
I've been encouraged by the shift in the response that people have to housing projects in general and affordable housing projects, because it used to be NIMBYs were the dominant voice, but now we have this whole counter movement of YIMBYs that's helping to balance that out and say, yes, we need more neighbors. We need more housing for everyone.
Yeah, I toured the Northeast for a month when the book came out in November, December. And in Somerville, Massachusetts, there's a current city council member who was my conversation partner, Ben Ewenkampen, and he really wanted me to hammer home for the Somerville audience. When I lived there 15 years ago, how anti-housing the city government was and many advocates were. And Ben was one of the first people to run for their city council on a pro-housing, pro-affordable housing platform. And I think the hipster in him wants recognition for that, maybe, because now everyone in Somerville is saying we want more housing, we want more bike infrastructure. So it's an encouraging trend.
It is. And I am also an attorney and have sat on the private side of affordable housing development before I worked for the city. And I would regularly think, I don't know if it's everywhere, but in Nebraska, a lot of our affordable housing providers don't have in-house counsel. They pay outside legal counsel, but a lot of our developers, private developers, just have someone on staff. And the cost difference has to be huge, but our affordable housing developers could write the attorney's fees in as part of being able to get grant money and such, but they can't justify a salary. And those are all, like, those kinds of nuances are always so ridiculous to me. I'm like, if you put me on salary, I cost you a lot less in the long run, but you can charge me out across different projects if I'm your outside counsel. And that has got to be adding so much money to every project. And I don't know if it's the same in the design world too with architects, but there's stupid games that we all have to play to fit into the box requirements that federal, state, or local money has. It's very frustrating.
That's exactly right. And I would add, for a podcast that talks about innovations and planning all the time, and we're asking, what's the cool thing you've seen or what have you learned? It's incredibly hard to innovate if you can't iterate. And it's hard even to follow up on other people's innovations if you don't have the capacity to have that kind of thinking in-house. I worked at the Community Builders, which is a large nonprofit affordable housing developer in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, Midwest. We had brilliant lawyers on staff. And the luxury I had as a development project manager to walk down the hall and think through complex financial and legal structuring issues with those lawyers allowed me to deliver more affordable housing for people faster. And smaller nonprofit developers, which is maybe the largest section of the affordable housing ecosystem, don't have that luxury. You have to get to an economy of scale before you can afford that. And like you said, it's not just legal. That applies across any number of disciplines. So innovating in the first place, but then really implementing the things we're learning is that much harder in our field than, in tech fields or manufacturing fields where you can iterate thousands, tens of thousands of times.
And as we've already kind of talked about a few times, the U.S. subsidizes housing in many different ways, both market and affordable. But I don't know if our readers would ever realize that the largest way that we subsidize housing is actually through the home mortgage interest deduction, which, of course, exclusively benefits homeowners, private homeowners. So why, in your opinion, is this form of subsidy acceptable? Then you have to beg for like any other form of subsidy in housing.
It sounds simplistic, but I can't come to any conclusion other than it's just about who benefits. And by definition, where homes that generate enough interest, mortgage interest, that you have a deduction to make, those are wealth. You have to have quite a bit of property wealth to benefit. So by definition, this is a program that only benefits the wealthy. It also is very disproportionately suburban and disproportionately white. And I think that's why. The largest affordable housing funding program since 1986 has been the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. There's a lot to be said for and against it. It's complicated, it's inefficient, but the quality and sustainability that's provided has far exceeded anything that Section 8 or public housing were able to accomplish. And I'm left wondering if it's in part the same answer. Well, it's who benefits from the low-income housing tax credit? Well, the large corporate investors and banks that make 20% returns on these credits are certainly amongst the beneficiaries, and maybe that's what has helped protect the low-income housing tax credit program when Congress and their analogs in state and local governments have spent my entire lifetime cutting Section 8 and cutting public housing.
Yeah, it really comes down to who has a voice and who has the connections to the policymakers that are making these decisions. And there just aren't enough large advocacy organizations that can really make that case and advocate for preserving federal funding or increasing federal funding towards affordable housing. I think in this last legislative cycle, there was a lot of work done by individuals at local, state, and federal levels to preserve what little funding we had with the continuum of care grants and that whole process under fire. And so like a ton of effort and coordination and outreach went out just to save what we had versus even just trying to get anything else.
That's right. And I think that's been the story of the last 4 decades or so. You talked about how hard we have to fight just to protect funding, let alone try to expand it. And in the book, I reserve a fair amount of criticism for Democratic Party leaders. And that's a complete 180 from what we normally have to do in the affordable housing world, which is praise our politicians for every penny we get, lest we never get another penny. So I talk about the Biden administration as their opening budget proposal, proposing to leave, by their own undercount, a Minneapolis-sized population of people homelessness in this country. And that was the opening bit. What they got in the budget was 1/10 of that. So there's really been a bipartisan consensus on not funding housing for a very, very long time. And while I understand the professional need to use positive reinforcement with politicians and to advocate for what we need and try to end cuts and ask for what we think we can get, with this book, I'm trying to make a strong demand for what we need. It's not simply about political possibility or plausibility in politics from where we're sitting today or from 10 years ago. I think we need to be really honest about the absolute minimum that is needed, which is to fully fund these programs and to do away with exclusionary zoning. And I don't feel like keeping a lot of praise on people who, want to give us half of that and then ask for praise.
To that point, our last episode was all about the progressive movement and how it has high ideals, wants to solve all these issues, but is getting absolutely nothing done because no one can agree on how to do it. And it's the swing back and forth between whether Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian impulses. But the Democrats, we think they're going to get these things done. They're supportive of this, but in reality, they're not prioritizing. Yeah, so it's very interesting. Another challenge in doing affordable housing projects is balancing, as planners, our desire for community feedback and input, but also being able to get these projects off the ground and running. How do you balance diverse community input while also trying to avoid unraveling projects altogether?
To me, the keys are really giving people a meaningful opportunity to make meaningful changes to a proposal. So that's showing up to community before you have really nice renderings, right? Sketchy conceptual design in pencil or closest to it if possible, right? Like show people that you are willing to make meaningful changes based on their feedback. And also to be able to make those changes, we have to ask at the right time. And the formal processes that a jurisdiction might require may or may not line up with that. The informal processes are often just as, if not more important. There are many informal vetoes in the process. If the wrong community group or the wrong trades union or the wrong elected official doesn't like your project, you can lose it. So there's part of the entitlement process is just survivor, right? You got to make sure you don't anger any of these people and you have to satisfy them enough to get through. But then there's that full bit of it of how do we actually get better design? And the example I like to use was the last project that I managed in Boston before I moved to Seattle was in the neighborhood my grandmother grew up in Forest Hills, across from an MBTA terminal. It's a neighborhood I had lived in, I had a lot of close friends in. At the community meetings, I still got the treatment as if I was some alien coming in to change the neighborhood of people who'd only lived there for 10 or 15 years. But I also organized really hard to get a number of voices in and around the neighborhood. I think you have mentioned on this podcast before, one of the contradictions in this whole process is you don't build homes for people who are already living in homes in a place. So we don't involve in the community process the residents, potential small business owners on the ground floors, any of the people that might actually use the building, often not at the table. So I find bringing them in is really important. And to that diversity point, I've had many times in my career where someone who is different from me, who looks at the world a little bit differently, caught something really meaningful. In that Forest Hills project, it was a woman saying, the way you have this circulation in the back of the building looks dangerous to me. I wouldn't feel safe there. I certainly wouldn't feel safe there at night. It's like, oh, I missed that. And that was really good feedback. And I think there's many places in design where we need to make sure that we're designing for everybody and we get really good feedback when we actually solicit that. I also find it is helpful for that mixed use bit because, again, the community in some senses cares less about what's going on upstairs than what they can get downstairs. And in affordable housing, doing retail leasing can be incredibly difficult because our timeframes are insane and no reasonable business is going to plan on our timeframe. So we have to essentially build space on spec and hope we can get something good in there later most of the time. But the community process I've also used as a time to really solicit people who might be thinking of building a business in 4 years, or maybe they're working from a food truck now and they want to go brick and mortar in 4 years, which is how long it's going to take me to build this project, and we can do something together. So summing up that ramble, just making sure that the people whose feedback we want and need have the opportunity, are in the room, and that it's meaningful. And that may or may not actually line up with the official processes we have to go through.
Here in Lincoln, we use tax increment financing as an incentive for affordable housing if you are building residential. And one of the biggest problems we have is trying to do some kind of mixed use. So we have mixed income because most of our projects are market-based, and to receive that public benefit, we require you provide a percentage of those market units at affordable, but then we put commercial down below. And we have a bunch of these buildings right now with our commercial just sitting vacant for years because it's really hard to identify what services the tenants are going to need. Or I know they're going to need a grocery store, but how do I put a grocery store in a mixed use building? It's very frustrating. And I don't know how to solve that problem.
Money. Isn't money always the solution? I mean, seriously though, there's a real issue with tenant improvements. And if I have a shell space and I want to build out a grocery store, or I want to build out a preschool and I need a ton of extra plumbing and whatever, a restaurant, these are expensive things. In market real estate, you'll often have developers view that restaurant or grocery store or preschool downstairs as a loss leader, the same way they would view building out a swimming pool or a gym, right? It's an amenity, so you can charge more upstairs. Of course, in affordable housing, that's absolutely impossible. We don't want to charge more upstairs. And the monies that we use to build are absolutely forbidden to be used on anything except exactly what they're supposed to be used on. I have worked on ways to try to pull money in there. Early learning, I think, is a great place to pull systems together because we're so mission aligned. We have insane financing systems, both in early learning and housing, and architecturally, we can make it work a lot. So in Washington State, we've developed a couple sources, purely public, as well as private-public partnerships leveraged with philanthropy and community development financial institution dollars to create funding sources for those ground floors. We also, I tell the city of Seattle, they should always be bragging about this program, the Equitable Development Initiative, which is something that really came out of community here and provides both capital and capacity building money for communities to undertake all sorts of developments with or without housing so that they can build the birthing center, the community center, the bookstore, the food innovation center, what have you, that the community really wants. And that tension we often have between the dollars per unit, we need to solve the housing crisis, build as much housing as possible, and the community development, we really want to make it a good place to live. EDI, the Equitable Development Initiative in Seattle, has been a great way to try to turn that tension on its head and provide resources that then help these two things help each other out rather than competing for scarce resources.
That is excellent. I will check out that resource because I also, on the other side, I'm on the board of a community land trust, and we're also trying to find that same balance on commercial side and create commercial units in our land trust as well. Bottom line is land development is really confusing, and because it is, and mostly just very frustrating, how do you continue to remain positive and impactful in a profession whose goal is to really, you want to do the work, but often the people within our same profession can be dismissive of lived experiences and the needs of the people that you're trying to help. So how do you keep a sunny disposition?
I'm not sure I do. And I'd say the dismissiveness and the disrespect and the misunderstandings are the things that I have the hardest time with. There's a cultural dislocation that comes from growing up lower class and then existing in and working in the professional world. many books written on the topic, and I have a good few examples in mine from the affordable housing world specifically. And there's this extra kind of almost moral injury to it happening in our space where, well, if the point is we're trying to create better communities for people like me, if we're trying to do it better for the next kid, how are you so dismissive of what those kids actually need? And why don't you value the voice of someone who used to be one of them? It can be really hard. There's a lot of time, and it starts in college, right? You're studying urban planning and you're reading texts about what do we do about these people, but you are these people, those people. It can be hard to take, and I think there's a lot of almost dissociation that's necessary to survive in that space and appear positive, because of course appearing positive is necessary for working anywhere outside of the Northeast, where we do get away with yelling and cursing at each other. How I keep going and how I keep working is knowing that even if my work isn't going to solve the housing crisis writ large, this feeling of bailing water against the tide, I know on a very intimate, visceral level that every home we're able to build and provide as a safe, quality of place to live for a household, we solve that household's housing crisis. And that really does mean the world. And it's that thought that keeps me moving forward, bailing water against the tide in a system that can be hostile.
I love that. And I think it's very well put, changing your perspective. If all your time and energy helps one household, that's still one household that would not have been helped. So, if we know how to build and fund housing projects, what do you think is the most important thing that needs to change in order to get more affordable housing built?
Again, the necessities to build any homes, place to build, permissions to build there, resources to direct labor and materials. We have no shortage of places in this country. Even our most expensive urban areas have surface parking, which to me that says you have space. So from where we're sitting today, we need to fully fund housing. That could look like funding Section 8 at a level where everyone who is eligible gets a voucher. That could look like a universal basic income. That could look like any number of ways where we actually make sure that everyone's need for a place to live gets translated into economic demand for a place to live that can be well maintained and for additional rehab or development to create more of them. So money is the very biggest thing. And then those permissions, also huge. Exclusionary zoning needs to go the way of racially restrictive covenants. I talk in the book about how looking at the Supreme Court decisions upon which it rests, which themselves rest on great decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, and other policies that rest on the same legal frameworks that our zoning rests on, have been ruled unconstitutional. Congress could also do it. I realize saying that the Supreme Court or Congress could do something good, again, it's a little bit fantasy sitting in 2026. So at whatever jurisdictional level people can work, removing those barriers, getting rid of exclusionary zoning, fully funding, those are non-negotiable. We can't solve this without those. There's an image I've been using that I didn't think of till after the book and would have been nice to have in there, of it's really a three-legged stool, that we need the resources to build or we can't do anything at all. We need to be allowed to build. But even given that, without really strong protection for residents' rights, right, just cause eviction preventions, foreclosure preventions, et cetera, it's really wobbly and the system can be taken advantage of really well. And so from a book standpoint, I don't know, make a stool out of abundance, evicted, and color of law, and then we can start, resting on something maybe.
One of the points that you make, speaking of tenants' rights, in the book, you talk about how our entire legal jurisprudence on property ownership and living rights is actually based in English common law. And English common law set up the property rights that they have to make it as simple as possible for a lord to kick out a serf, and then expanded those property rights to make sure that the crown could kick out Irish people or people living in India or whatever in the easiest and fastest way possible. And then the United States just whole ham dropped that legal process into our books. And now we just accept that as like, oh yeah, obviously that's the best way that we should do it, when we don't have a crown theoretically lording over us at this point, and property ownership is not necessarily the end all be all of everything. And I think you did a really good job of like laying out how that process got here and why it sucks.
Thank you. Yeah. This is not the main focus of the book, but the thing that I walked away from researching and writing that kind of most changed the way I see the world was I started out exploring these two separate questions. How did we get here? How did we get here as a nation? How did my family get to the level of being lower class and affordable housing and whatnot that we were? And the answers really collided. On the individual level, it's like we were poor because we were poor, because we were poor, because we were poor, because the Brits stole our land, set the rent at everything you can possibly produce except for those potatoes over there maybe, and then used evictions as a form of genocide. And that's how we ended up over here. And the over here, our legal framework, similarly, right? It was England for the first 150 years. And then the fledgling United States in the late 17, early 1800s, I read some of these legal texts where they're debating, we are a new country. Should we just use English common law? Should we use English poor laws as the basis for how we think about charity and helping folks out? Should we use English land title as the basis for our real estate system? Because there's a really good land title in Massachusetts from 1800 that spends hundreds of pages to create an argument that basically says, well, the King of England said this land is ours, and even if that was a bad thing, it's ours now. So let's just go with it. And now living where I do in the Pacific Northwest, where that history of colonialism, land entitlement, etc., is really only 150, 180 years old, as opposed to the 400 or some in Boston, has been really hard to unsee once I've seen this. There's a flip way of saying this, is that I derive a lot of hope for the future, knowing that we have not always lived the way we live. And in fact, this system, which prioritizes separating the worthy from the unworthy above all else, is a very peculiarly Puritan British cultural artifact that we live with, that viewing housing not as a necessity, but as a commodity or a means of social control is not common amongst most world cultures throughout history. And even the British have only been acting this way for 400 or 500 years out of a very long history. So I do take a lot of hope from knowing the way we're doing things right now that we take for granted and we think is just the world as it is maybe an aberration historically. And we don't have to keep doing it this way.
It's a beautiful sentiment to end on. So always our last question, because it is Booked on Planning. What books would you recommend our readers check out?
So I'm going to skip past the obvious American housing books many of you have covered, from Greg Colburn and Richard Rothstein and Matt Desmond and Larry Vail, for a few Irish books, because I think the comparative perspective can teach us a lot. So Rory Hearn's Gaffs, Why No One Can Get a House and What We Can Do About It, would be kind of the Irish version of my book, or maybe one of Greg Colburn's books. And the author is now a member of the Dáil, which is the Irish Parliament, and really great stuff in here. And I think that historical perspective of this kind of goes back to British colonialism, I think becomes clearer when you compare what's happening here to what's happening in Ireland. Katrina O'Sullivan's Poor. It's a memoir by a professor of psychology about her experiences growing up poor in both the UK and Ireland. Gorgeous memoir. I wish I could write that well. And then Blind Boy Boat Club, pen name of a fantastic writer, musician, podcaster. This is his latest collection of short stories, Topographia Hibernica. And besides the beautiful writing, I think Blind Boy is incredibly talented at shedding light on those little messy, forgotten, overgrown parts of our cities and towns that I think is really essential to urban planning as well.
I love it. No one's ever given us a list of recommended readings from another country, so it's great.
Well, for the month that's in it.
True. Jamie, thank you again for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, Bittersweet Lane, Creating Homes in the American Affordable Housing Crisis.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with author Jamie Madden on his book, Bittersweet Lane, Creating Homes in the American Affordable Housing Crisis. You can get your own copy through the publisher at Rouse Publishing by supporting your local bookstore or supporting the show through our page at bookshop.org/shop/bookedonplanning. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.